Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, well, watching other people go through it, people who are older than us, like Mikey from Fits of Depression, we would all watch him struggle with heroin. He'd be like really skinny one week and really bloated the next, and everyone would be like, well, if Mikey's bloated, that means he's just drinking a lot and he's not doing heroin anymore. Like, we all would discuss his drug use, not with him, but with each other. I mean, we could see that all happening on this other level. And again, with Kurt Cobain or whatever, like we'd all watched it from a distance, but it wasn't until later that it hit us personally. It seemed like with Kai and Chris.
Because Chris's experience, it wasn't something that Scott knew about, right, initially?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the first time he did heroin was with Sean Kelly after they watched Train Spotting. Ironic. I was actually there that night, but I was in a completely different vibe hanging out with that band Comic Gain from England, and we were all like having a hoot nanny, and in walks Chris and Sean, and we were like, what's wrong with them? They're really out of it, We had no idea that's what they had done. We just thought they were being grumpy, actually. Yeah, and I'm sure that he hid it from Scott, because Scott would have been really judgmental about it, and rightly so, really, in a way. Chris would have been better off not doing the heroin.
So you think Chris knew that Jared and Scott would not have it?
Yes, absolutely. Chris knew they wouldn't approve of that.
Why do you think he went along with it anyway? With presumably carb's probably the most important thing to him as well, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, he had a flirtation with drugs. I mean, he wanted to try it. He had tried probably everything else. And wanted, who knows, probably just wanted the experience. And I think once you have that experience, it's pretty hard to not keep wanting it if it's, if you have a good first experience.
Yeah, you said he seemed kind of grumpy.
He did seem grumpy.
How else did you think he seemed like, because you're talking about the first night for him.
The first night. I don't know, they came out of his bedroom, because I think he was living there at the time. We were out at the Lucky 7 house. And, he just sort of looked at us very oddly, and then they went outside. And apparently that was because Sean was throwing up and threw up all night. I was just like, what is up with Chris? But he was kind of grumpy and naturally, so we didn't know he'd tried anything.
And we kind of lumped it together a minute ago, but like ultimately when like Chris tries to kill himself,
right?
That's like a week later, right?
Yes, it is. I remember because I was living with Sean Kelly at the time, and Sean and Chris were pretty much best friends. And I don't know who called him, probably Jared or Scott called at 4 a.m. or maybe Audrey called at like 4 a.m. The phone kept ringing and ringing and ringing and ringing, and I was like, what is going on? And I didn't see Sean until probably mid-afternoon the next day. He told me what had happened. But that was really traumatic. I think, I haven't spoken to Audrey in years, but I think that was really, really traumatic for her, his wife at the time.
Were you, well, first of all, what happened?
Well, my understanding is they were fighting, and he, she left the house, and in that time period, he hung himself. I don't know that if he fell or if she had to cut him down or what happened. But I think there was some, initial sort of damage. It's terrible.
Were you, what was your kind of emotional reaction to that news? Were you surprised, or were you like, oh, that makes sense, Chris is really upset? Like,
right.
What did you...
I was upset. I wasn't totally shocked, but I was upset. Everybody was pretty upset by that.
Did that seem like something out of left field for him, like as a friend?
No. I didn't think it seemed like something out of left field. It seemed like something that could totally have happened, He always did seem... oh God, I just realized. Never mind. I'm done. I just was like, oh God, Chris is going to watch this. And, be like, why is she analyzing me? I don't want her to analyze me. Because I never, it's like I don't know everything about Chris. I'm not the authority.
No, you're just someone who knew him.
Yeah,
Um,
I can only speak from my experience.
so what after when that happened, like what kind of effect that specific event did you see on Scott?
Um, it was a weird time period for me. That time period is I was really suffering from a lot of anxiety, and it was probably when Scott and I were the least close. Because I couldn't really leave my house, and he didn't really have a lot of patience for that. I'd be like, I'm having a panic attack. He'd be like, I'm leaving, which I actually kind of appreciate now to this, At the time, it made me upset, but I sort of understood that impatience. So I wasn't really around too much for all of that. We talked about it. I knew how upset he was. I knew how worried he was. But I wasn't there every day. I wasn't there in the way that I had been before when we were roommates.
Okay. So could maybe you just say then that he was upset or he was worried or like what you were saying?
Yeah. I mean, Scott was definitely upset, and he was very worried about Chris. Um, there was a lot of uncertainty about what to do next, but everybody was mostly just worried that Chris was okay.
And what ages are we talking about here?
That's a good question. I was probably like 22, 23. Scott would have been 21, 20. He was a year younger than me.
And were Scott, Chris, and Jared of the same age?
Yes, I think. No, Jared's a little bit older, but not too much.
So they're basically the same.
Yeah, they're basically the same age.
Okay, cool. You're right. And so this gets back to what we were talking about before, which is this is an awful lot to process for someone who's this age.
Right. Yes. This is a young age to deal with a lot of really heavy stuff. And I don't, probably most of us didn't deal with it very well. I just retreated into my house and had panic attacks. Chris started using drugs, and, Scott started drinking more. Jared got a girlfriend. These are the things I remember about this time period.
In your opinion, like thinking back, did it seem like there was a relationship between these two events that happened a week apart from each other?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I'm not sure that anybody knew about the heroin until the hanging incident. I think that's when Sean told everyone, and people were really upset with Sean. Really upset with Sean. Audrey was really upset. Scott was really upset. They felt like you have to be smarter than this. Like, don't let Chris use heroin. That's not a good idea. And I think they sort of put almost more responsibility on Sean at that moment than Chris, because they couldn't really be mad at Chris. He was in the hospital.
So how did one link to the other?
I mean, they both seem to sort of come from like a bottoming out point. It's like, what am I gonna do? Well, I don't really care. I'll try heroin, or maybe I'll try to kill myself. Who knows? Those things seem related to me. Sort of death wishy, rock bottom.
And what was kind of the general context then leading up to that would cause that kind of rock bottomy mindset?
I don't know. I really wasn't hanging out with Chris at the time, at all. So I'm not really sure what happened. I mean, he and Michelle had broken up years before. He was married to Audrey, I think. They were married. If not, they were going to get married. They seemed happy together. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it was.
What about with the band? What was kind of going on generally for the band in that time period?
The band seemed to be doing fairly well. I mean, they were putting out great records. They were on K, and they were touring a lot. I remember, there being a little bit of fighting between Chris and Scott on tour, but that's just because I got the letters, so we were complaining about those things. But you always fight with your bandmates on tour. It seemed to me like things were going well with Carp.
Oh, Jared brought up an interesting thing too that I thought, and I'd be interested in getting your opinion on it. It was that now it almost seems ridiculous to talk about this, but we're talking about a time that was kind of a little bit pre, like, talk show, like everybody's talking about bipolar disorder
Right.
and manic depression,
Yeah.
and there's workshops and everything
Yeah.
for everything.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, there was an element of Chris that was self-medicating, obviously, and I think that was probably kind of true of Scott when he started drinking a lot more, you know. Um, but a lot of people self-medicated, in Olympia. There was a lot of drinking. There was, some heroin. There was other things going on. But yeah, I mean, we didn't think like Chris is bipolar or, Scott is depressed or whatever, like we didn't think these things about our friends. They weren't terms that we thought about. Be like, that guy's grumpy. you know.
So, what did you think Scott like wouldn't want Chris to do because of it, like a general effect on the band? Like, what did you think he thought Chris's behavior's effect would
Right.
be on?
Well, I mean, we'd all heard horror stories about fits of depression touring and Mikey not being able to find drugs and Brian sticking his hand in a bag and poking himself with a needle. Like we had all had these stories that were fairly close to us. But also, I'm sure he just didn't want Chris to become a junkie. He cared about him. He didn't want him to be unhealthy. He didn't want him to die. And I think, Scott was kind of, at that time, really in control and always very much wanted to be in control. And I think maybe that sort of out of control element was too much to deal with in a small van, But I think mostly he just wanted Chris to be healthy and not a drug addict.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What do you think about that time period between that Chris trying to hang himself and when they ultimately decide there's no way?
Right. See, again, my brain is failing me for that time period. So that was like 97?
98, I think, the very beginning of fall, like tail end of summer, 98, right. I think is when they disbanded for sure.
Yeah.
And Chris's thing, I remember it was on April Fool's
Day.
Yes,
I remember that because it's true. I didn't believe everybody. I was like, yeah, whatever, April Fools. I think I showed that to Sean and he was just like, believe it. So they didn't break up for like 6 months. Is that true? No, longer than that because, well, things started. We went on our first tour fall of 2008, and when we came home from that tour, we played with Carp in the Evaporators at the Eagles Hall or something, and that was the last time I saw them before their reunion show. So yeah, that makes sense. The fall of 2008.
Can you say that that Chris thing happened on April Fool's
Day?
Oh
yeah.
I don't know if anyone has said that.
Oh, okay. So Chris hung himself on April Fool's Day, and it was, I thought it was a joke at first.
Because
that's the kind of humor, dark humor, Chris had. I didn't know to believe it or not when I first heard about it.
It's definitely not a joke.
No, definitely not a joke.
Okay, so what do you think about then when they, like, so you were talking about before, like, Scott's identifying himself completely
yes
with Carp,
with
right?
Carp,
and then it becomes apparent that Carp isn't going to make it. Right.
Yeah, it became apparent. I think probably that summer for them, that it wasn't going to work out. And I think he had a lot of. Oh God. Was this the time period he started talking about being a session musician? Like he had all these ideas of things he could do, that were outside of Carp. And that was a total fantasy then. But, I think he started becoming a lot like Scott was always very social, but he became more of a party guy during this time period. He started working at Thekla, as the door guy, and that started becoming more of his identity in a way. It was like, part of, at least it wasn't anywhere near the carp thing, but it was one of, these handful of things that were important to him, I'm sure, because he loved his coworkers and, they had such a good time. I also think he really liked being a bouncer, which is weird, but it's true. I don't know. I just wasn't as close to everybody during this time period, so I'm trying to think, like, can I really say these things on their behalf? I wish Scott were here to tell us.
What do you think Scott would think of what Jared's doing now?
Oh, I think Scott would, be 100% supportive and jealous of what Jared's doing now. I think if Scott were alive, he would be part of what's going on, in some way. He would have totally moved to LA. He would have done all these things, I think he and Jared were sort of always assumed they would play music together throughout their lives, off and on.
What was it like to see them not play together that whole period of time between Carp ending and the Whip beginning?
Right. Well, Carp did play one show, right? It was like Yo-Yo Go-Go 2000 or something. They did a reunion show.
Oh, I maybe don't know about that. That was like as late as 2000.
I have a lot of photos from it that Sean took.
Was Jared wearing like a blue Hawaiian? Because I have a shitload of photos.
Right.
Unfortunately, they're all really crappy.
Scott has blonde hair when they're doing this show. When were there Yo-Yo Go-Go's? Because it was a Yo-Yo Go-Go.
That's 97. He had blonde hair in 97. And 96, 97, because I just looked at all this footage.
But there was there was a Carp reunion show after they had actually broken up. And because I cried at that. I know that it happened. I swear to God. Unless they didn't break up before that, right?
I think they broke up a few times. Because I think the one that you're talking about is Jessica was talking about. Jessica talked a lot about this show too, and
yeah, you're right. It was not that late.
I think, because my idea about it was that it was right around the last tour, like they went on that tour.
It was, yeah.
Well, because I think Jared was telling me like Chris hangs himself, and then
right.
A few months later they go on that last
right.
tour.
Right.
And
then they played Yo-Yo, but then they played, so maybe that was after the reunion was the show that we played together. The Evaporators one. Because it had to have been then, because I hadn't gone on tour yet. And I remember that day because there was all this drama on the tour, and it all came down at that show. So maybe that reunion show was at Yo-Yo, that summer. I have all the photos. And and maybe that was my memory of of them being so funny at Vern's stepdad's house or whatever. Maybe that was that same Yo-Yo.
Okay, let me switch.
But I remember them being broken up and thinking they weren't playing together anymore. And then there was this Yo-Yo Go-Go show that they played. And none of us had seen them play together for a really long time. And I don't think anyone thought they were going to play together again. And I remember standing in the back by myself, watching them play, and just watching Scott and how happy he was. And I just started crying, It was so good to see them together again.
Did you see a difference in Scott when, just as a person, as an individual, in times when he was playing with Jared and times that he wasn't playing with Jared?
Yeah, he seemed pretty driven whenever he and Jared were playing music. I think he's always very ambitious, and I think Jared sort of helped him sort of realize those ambitions. Because I'm not sure that he was very ambitious on his own. He kind of needed the qualities that Jared has.
So they just kind of fit well together.
Yeah, they did. Virgos and Tauruses.
So, tell me about the whip. Like, seeing that happen.
I definitely heard about it before I had seen them because I don't think they played their first show in Olympia. The first time I saw them play was at, God, it was probably called the Volcano Room at the time, the place that Thekla moved into. And they were playing with that band Rye Coalition, who I didn't even know were still a band at the time, and I felt really bad for not knowing that. But the Whip opened for them at that show, and yeah, it was another one of those moments where I cried seeing those two play together. I mean, the way that they play, Scott's drums were always so great with Jared, you know, with his voice and his riffs. Like, it was always such a good combination.
Did you feel like it related to Carp at all?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I'm a big Joe Preston Thrones fan, so you know, there was part of me that missed Chris up there, but you know, it was also nice to see Joe, to see them play together, because they had been such big fans of his as teenagers, you know, and then grown up and, you know, befriended Joe, and Joe was a great friend of theirs, and then playing music together. It's pretty cool.
Do you think it was it your idea from knowing those guys that it was like an emotional process to, like, you know, face up to, like, do you think they had to confront the things that had happened to them in order to play together again?
Yeah, I think it was probably very emotional for them to play, and I think it was hard for them to decide to play not with Chris. You know, I mean, I think they had to face the fact that at that moment Chris was not healthy enough, really, to play music at that time and to tour, and you know, I think that they had kind of had him at arm's length during that time period, because he was still using heroin.
Yeah, what was your knowledge of what was going on for Chris, kind of post-band into that period?
It seemed like he really struggled, you know, trying to get healthy, or trying maybe to hide his drug use. We were all sort of confused because everyone was like, well, Chris is getting better, Chris is better. And then, you know, we'd find out like a month later, no, Chris has been using this whole time secretly, and these are these people he's been shooting up with. And, you know, I think with any drug use, there's a lot of lying and deceit. And I think that takes its toll even on the best of friends. You know, you feel like something weird happens where people who are using drugs on a regular basis have to lie about everything. It's this weird thing. Like, they're lying about things that you don't even need to lie about. And you catch them, you know, just saying the stupidest things. You're like, what? Like, that's just a total lie, you know, and your friendship just fractures at that point. There's no trust. You don't know what's going on. You don't know how to take care of this person. You don't know how much you want to be involved because you don't really want to get super hurt, you know. And I think it was really hard for them to decide to play without Chris, you know, but it was a great band, you know. I'm glad they did. I'm glad they play music together again.
You're talking about the lying for lying's sake.
Yeah.
Now, would that be like a normal thing? Like, would Chris lying to Jared Scott be a normal part of their relationship previous to this?
I don't know if it was or not. I don't know. It could have been. I don't know.
How do you think, like, Scott, like, looked back? Did you? Well, maybe, you know, if you guys didn't hang out too much back then, or that whip time period, you can tell me about, like, if he kind of, like, as late as possible for him, like, looking back on Carp.
Right. Well, I think he was angry at Chris. You know, I think, but I always think he loved what Carp was and what Carp had been. You know, I think he was really proud of it.
Why do you think he was angry at Chris?
I think he was angry at Chris because he wanted to continue playing with Chris, you know, and he wanted to continue being friends with Chris, and that was really hard.
When you look at the what ultimately do you feel like the carp story is?
Uh, it is the carp story. It's a story about friendships and relationships and um, people who really love each other, but they're all dysfunctional because we all are, trying to make it work, um, and ultimately it didn't. But they had those really great records, those really great shows, and I'm certain that if Scott were alive, they would have continued their friendship throughout their lives and figured it out. I mean, it's a shame that he's not here to see that Chris is clean or Jared so successful.
What do you think about big business and Jared joining the Melvins? Do you feel like that's like, you know, like a weird ethereal continuation? Or, you know what I mean? Or
Yeah, no, I think Jared and Big Business and Melvins is a continuation of everything that Jared has done musically, and it makes complete sense. The first time I saw Big Business, I got kind of mad because I felt like Cody was sort of trying to play like Scott. I was like, he's not like Scott. He should stop trying to play like Scott. And then I saw them again later, and he wasn't, so it made me happy. It was like he was trying to fit into those shoes at first, and then found his own.
now we were talking before about how like how like it was emotional and they would have to face some things to play together in the whip. Um, what was your impression of what? Because that kind of happened again for Jared,
Right.
right?
Yeah, I'm sure. When he was starting Big Business, it was probably extremely emotional. Um, but it's good that he didn't take too long to do it. I remember at Jared's funeral in the weeks afterward. I mean, Jared, sorry. I remember it. Say this again. I remember at Scott's funeral, and the weeks afterwards, Jared just talking about feeling kind of lost. Like, where is Scott? And Chris is kind of, to me, in the same place. Like, I can't reach him, and I don't know how he's gonna be. It seemed so sad.
I don't know. I always kind of felt like just to see Jared, being big business is like such an impressive thing to me
Yeah.
because it's kind of like what ultimately all adults have to do but don't necessarily do,
Right.
which is take your personal scariest
Right.
fears
Right.
and integrate them into who you are and do that and
Yeah.
be that.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, Jared's a really inspiring person, and he's, um, gone through a lot and dealt with a lot and dealt with it very well in a way. I mean, he keeps playing music and he keeps doing great things, and you know, I get really happy when I see him randomly in places around the world. I'll be like, wait, there's Jared at South by Southwest or whatever. It makes me really happy.
And Chris too is an interesting person because he's almost like the opposite. Like he's almost somebody who's been led around by the tail by their own
Right.
fears for a really long time, and quite miraculously seems like when I first met him again, I was expecting to be facing like this old junkie,
Right.
but he seems he's like still like smart.
Right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, Chris is really one of the smartest people I've ever met. Like, scarily smart. And that's why he would always get you. He would always know exactly what to say to make you just feel like, oh, God. But he was extremely intelligent. And maybe that's part of the burden, I mean, growing up in Tumwater and, maybe not knowing how to deal with it all.
Assuming there is an ultimate recovery for
Right.
Chris, and it looks that way right now.
Yeah, that's amazing news.
Yeah, how do you feel about that, and especially just kind of and when compared to this long time period where it looked like it wasn't going to happen?
Yeah. Well, to hear that Chris is doing better and that he might actually be clean or be getting clean is amazing. You never know. You never know if people are going to make it out or not. You never know how long it's going to take them to make it out, or how long they're going to be out for. But, I mean, that's all you can ever hope for is that somebody sort of makes it to the other side and stays there.
So what is like looking at like Jared's kind of musical life? What is that in kind of summation? What does that kind of look like to you?
Um, well, it seems like Jared just keeps working hard and keeps getting more and more recognition, which is fantastic. He's always playing like ATP or some crazy festival in Japan or something. You know, he's traveling around the world and doing what he always wanted to do. You know, it's amazing. It's hard to do. Having worked in music for 15 years, it's hard to do. But he's always been extremely talented and very charming. That helps. Can't discount that.
Do you like yeah, is this like a boyhood like dream coming true, or do you know what I mean? Is
Yeah.
this like what where he was always going?
I mean, it seems like it, right? You know? I mean, but the best part is he hasn't really changed what he's doing that much musically. I mean, he's gotten better and he's taken it farther, but it's sort of rooted in those, you know, rooted in the Northwest. It's rooted in that sound. It's rooted in Carp in a way, you know, which makes it even cooler.
And what about Chris? What do you see his life's like, assuming that there is this?
I have no idea. I don't even know what he's been doing, you know, or like what he's interested in doing. You know, sometimes people don't always want to play music forever. So I don't know if even he's interested in playing music or, you know, I don't know. I hope he would do whatever he wants to do.
Do you feel like he would need to be playing music in order for you to be like, oh, he's doing great?
No, not at all. Not at all. He can, you know, I'm not playing music right now. I just work in it.
And what about Scott? What when you look at like what he went through as a person, as a musician, as a bandmate, from kind of start to finish?
I mean, start to finish, Scott was like this sort of prodigy drummer that, you know, I had heard about before I had met him. You know, I'd heard that there was this fantastic drummer, and I think he was in a really terrible band, I forget the name, and he was really embarrassed about it. But everyone was like, the only good thing about that band, I think Burt Burgeon knows, the only good thing about that band, you know, was the kid, the drummer. And, you know, just watching him grow as a drummer and as a person, you know, we're the same age, so, you know, watching each other sort of grow up. You know, I would just, God, it's hard to think about. See, this is the part where I get teary. I don't want to. Just a second. But it seemed monumental when Scott and Jared both moved to Seattle. I forgot about that. I was like, wow, they got out. Because, you know, I had grown up in the Olympia area as well as them. I remember thinking, why would you want to move to Seattle? But they really loved it there. You know, they had a good time. And ultimately, that's when they seemed to be able to play music together again. Slightly sad that Scott never got to be a session musician, because that was always something I looked forward to for him. Because he just had this crazy fantasy about it. You know, like, I'm going to play on the next Shania Twain record, or whatever it was at the time. You know, he'd be like, I could do that. I could totally do that. I can play like anything. I'd be like, I know you can. When we were roommates, we had 2 drum sets. He had his and I had mine, and we'd set them up in the living room facing each other. And I'm a terrible drummer. I always wanted to be a good drummer, always been a terrible drummer. But we, you know, set these drum sets across from each other, and he would try to teach me his drum beats all the time, and it was so hard. You know, I got a few of them, but he was really patient. He was a good teacher.
They're not really like beginner drum beats.
They are not beginner drum beats. It's true. You know, I could do pa, do pa, and then he was kind of trying to teach me his shit, and I was like, oh God, I can't do this.
What do you think, Scott? What does Scott think about his mom?
Scott loved his mom. Scott loved his mom so much. You know, I mean, Scott and I really only dated for like, I don't know, 6-8 months or something. Seemed like a long time when you're young, but it wasn't. And I totally had to have dinner with his mom and his stepdad. But yeah, his mom was very important. And that list of things, she probably really should have been number one.
Excellent. So, what do you think about? You talked about. What do you think about Olympia now?
Well, I love Olympia. It will always be my home. You know, my family is still there, my sister and my parents. But I felt like at a certain point, most of my friends had sort of moved out. And the thing about Olympia is that it's always got this new, fresh crop of 19-year-olds that keep coming through. And when you're 30, it's not that exciting anymore, you know. I mean, you know, you like to see their bands, like, you know, but you've kind of like, if you want to start a band, and maybe you sort of already have played with everybody around your age group, you know, it seemed hard to sort of grow older there and play music. But maybe that's not true. Toby's been really successful at it, just for me. But it's still got shows, it's still got house parties, it's still got the same coffee shop, well, different coffee shop, but same street. I think that there's some weirdness coming in with condos in downtown, and people trying to develop it in weird ways that sound like the antithesis of what makes Olympia great. But you know, they stopped the port being used for the military in the war. Still, they, you know, they're protesting of Thriftway, you know, their ban of the Plan B, birth control. It caused a new state law. You know, I mean, there's things that are still pretty radical and rad about Olympia that will always be.
Do you think it's still the same maybe for some kids that are there that are...
I'm sure it is. I hope that it is. You know, that's my hope, is that everybody has that formative, amazing experience with the community. You know, that would be amazing.
Oh, can you explain, like, really simplistic terms what about Riot Girl?
Okay. Let me see. In simplistic terms. Well, Riot Girl was a movement started by women in Olympia and DC, and sort of all over, scattered around, but mainly those two cities, where people were sort of talking about, you know, let's make a space for women, and let's acknowledge that women are still, you know, oppressed, that our voices are still not heard, that things are certainly not equal, and we're angry, and we want to make a community that acknowledges this disparity and also works to sort of correct it, you know, in a way.
And can you talk about, or make a statement about what time period that was going on?
Riot Girl was probably 1991, 91. That was when Bikini Kill were starting, and it was a lot of them. And they were living in DC at the time, Bratmobile as well. So they were both kind of going back and forth, probably 90, 91. I was still in high school, I know that.
What effect do you think, if any, this had on Carla?
Well, I know it got a 7-inch discontinued. I was there for that part of that dialogue. You know, I think it affected everyone in Olympia. You know, I think sometimes it affected people in negative ways. You know, I think there were people that would dress up like Riot Girls for Halloween and make fun of it, dudes. I think that was a lot of what made people have problems with my sister, which was a reoccurring theme in this time period of people talking to me about their problems, because I was shy and seemed not as scary, I guess, younger. But I think it made them very conscious. I mean, I think, but who knows? Who knows if they would have been just as sensitive, you know, before. It's like, I thought of Scott and Jared as feminists, you know. And I think probably Chris was too.
Because that's a really important distinction, right? Like this, I mean, everybody you naturally would assume that like a big loud guy band
Right.
are big macho guys.
Right, yeah. They certainly were not macho guys. They were smart, and they were interested in what was going on. They were definitely a part of all of it.
Yeah, and this isn't even really a question, but I remember just for myself as a kid, like thinking like it was a kind of like a being so excited that it was kind of like a have your cake and eat it too kind of scenario.
Yeah. Well,
where like myself as like a young boy could go and be really boyish.
Yeah.
And get this really like exhilarating dude feeling without any negative impact.
Totally.
Like,
there wasn't
really?
there wasn't like a real macho scene at their shows, and that's what I think people miss about that sort of. They miss when they think or learn about the Olympia time period. There was a lot of integration. I mean, Toby was at the first Melvin show. They were her favorite band. Toby was in Bikini Kill. Like, she's an outspoken feminist. All these things were, weaved in and out of each other and were equally important to both camps. I think there was a politicization of Olympia that was actually really fascinating, and not just one little tiny like microcosm of it. It wasn't just like the Riot Girls hung out over here and hated Carp and Fits of Depression or whatever. It was like the Riot Girls were in the front of those shows. You could have your cake and eat it too. Totally.
Well, because it would be great if you talk about that for a second, because I don't know if anybody's stated quite clearly that like Fits of Depression, Bikini Kill, Unwound, Carp. I mean, these are very different bands.
Yeah.
Not even to talk about like Calvin's.
Right. Yeah, the whole K thing. Yeah, it's true. It's true. There was a lot of different styles of music happening in Olympia, but they all played together. Like I said, you could go see Beat Happening and Sun Velvet Sidewalk and Melvins or Fits of Depression or Fits of Depression with Bikini Kill. I saw they toured together. There were all these different things happening, but everybody was so into all the different things happening. We didn't all have to sound the same. And I would probably should say that most Riot Girls, like girls you would think of as Riot Girls, they didn't really call themselves Riot Girls in Olympia. Nobody called themselves the Riot Girl that I knew of, but they existed somewhere. This idea of them.
So this, and I've heard a lot of people describe it as like a grab bag or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that being like that is our identity.
Yeah.
Is that we get to do.
Yeah, it's true.
We want.
Yeah, it was the Olympia identity, and in turn, I think that it was also Kill Rock Star's identity, and that's why I feel so comfortable with it. I've never thought that when you like a certain style of music, you can only like this one style of music, or that they all have to sound the same or have the same, homogenized vision or something. It was that there was so much going on that I think that's why it worked. There was a little something for everyone.
And how do you feel like that Olympia grab bag DIY vibe compared to what was going on in Seattle in the early 90s?
Well, I think Olympia was very different in that there was a Seattle sound. There was never an Olympia sound. I think you could sort of say like, well, there was an Olympia sound. What about, Bratmobile or Bikini Kill? Or what about Carp or Gutted Silos? Like those, you can't do it because you start to pick a few bands and you can only go like 2 or 3. There's all these different styles of music happening.
And what we should talk about too is now we're talking about all of these bands happening in a town that has a population of like 40 or 50, 60,000.
Yeah. It was definitely, no more than 40,000 people. Olympia. But that's a college, you have this influx of people from all over the country or the world sometimes, And I think with Yo-Yo Go-Go brought in a lot more people. I think after that first Yo-Yo Go-Go, a lot of people moved there.
Because there's a lot of college towns, and there's not a lot of college towns that host a list of band names like
No, no, it's true. There's not. You can't make a list like that from Lawrence, Kansas, or Columbia, Missouri. I mean, they have cool scenes. You know, they have good venues and they have a few good bands, but it's not the same. They don't have the record labels, and you know that sort of pedigree of people. I mean, you just walk down the street and it'd be like, why is, you know, REM in town? It got to be really weird at this one time. It'd be like, is that Cynthia Plastercaster that just walked in? Like, what is going on? I mean, there was this brief period of time where Olympia was the place to be. And you thought, why are they here? But it was cool. I was there. I understood.
Sorry.
No. I'm not. I'm just rambling.
What do you think Carp's impact was on music or other bands, if any?
Oh, it was huge. There were all sorts of younger bands that came up that wanted to sound like Carp. I mean, and there were all sorts of bands that moved from North Dakota and Montana that, you know, there was all these dudes that moved to Olympia that wanted to be in Carp. I mean, it really was a big thing. I remember it was like the second generation of people moved into town. And that was their whole thing. You'd be like, I wanted to move to Olympia. I love Carp, you know?
What about now?
Well, you know, Jared is still influencing people with the Carp sound, really, because I mean, so much of Carp is Jared's sound, with Big Business. But I'm older, and I probably don't have a good idea of what kids are doing in the same way that I used to. I try, but it's hard. I'm 35.
What do you think Jared would have said, like, if you had approached young Jared,
Mm-hmm.
and like, one day you will play in the mountains?
I think he'd pee his pants. I'd be like, no way! You know, I mean, that's a dream come true. It's a shame Scott didn't get to. He would have loved that.
So what do you think about this? And this is my last question.
Okay.
What do you think about Scott when you think about him these days?
I mostly think of all the great things about Scott, you know. I can conjure his laugh still, which makes me really happy because he had one of the best laughs of all time. You know, I think about Scott pretty regularly. But, you know, mostly just the good things. You know, the way we would smile when we'd see each other, and like the big bear hugs and the laughs and the stupid things we used to do, the sit-up contests at 5 a.m. or whatever stupid thing we decide to do. The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. I think we watched it like 85 times one summer when we lived together. His weird obsession with video games. He had like a video game magazine stack in his closet this big with like secrets, like how to beat all the games. I remember when we found that. We were his roommates, and he subletted to our friend Megan from Australia. She was like, I opened the closet to put some stuff in here, and look what I found. We're like, it's not porn. It's just like stacks and stacks of video game magazines. And Mountain Dew containers.
Which reminds me, what was his diet like?
Oh, Jesus. Scott ate like crap. You know, I mean, it was every morning, it was Mountain Dew. There was always some coffee involved after that. Scott had some crazy ideas about the world. I just remembered when we were roommates, he decided he didn't want to pay for heat anymore. So he told us that he was going to just shut the door to his room and he wouldn't pay for heat. And he'd turn off the vent. And I was like, okay, Scott, then you can't use the bathroom. You have to go in and out of the window. Like, it's not just your room. He was a total cheapskate at that time. But we were all really poor. So, you know, he started to cut corners wherever. But his diet, he ate a lot of corn dogs. He ate a lot of A.M.P.M. You know, the A.M.P.M. hamburgers, corn dogs. I had to teach him how to make a can of soup once when he was really sick. He had bronchitis, and he was at my apartment. I was like, why don't you have a can of, like, you know, chicken noodle soup or tomato soup? I was like, Campbell's tomato soup. We have this in the cupboard. Here, you make it. And he looks at me, he's like, I don't know how to make that. I was like, really? You don't know how to make a can of soup? You don't know how to put it in there and heat it up? Add some water? So yeah, he didn't really, you know, do a lot of cooking as far as I knew. Maybe that happened later in his life, but I don't think so. I remember the time he got food poisoning and couldn't play the show. And then Ian Vanek played. But yeah, didn't eat very well.
Yeah, I don't. A side note, I grew up with Ian actually. Ian and Matt, it's weird.
Oh, cool.
In Yakima.
Really?
Yeah, well, that's how I got introduced to Olympia because we were playing music in Yakima when Ian was in junior high, and we were like a freshman. Me and Matt were freshmen, and then their whole family moved to Olympia.
Right.
So we were just going to Olympia to visit.
Oh, wow.
them.
That's awesome.
But then we were like, oh wait.
Yeah.
There's all this other stuff as well. So it's funny. Well, do you have any closing remarks?
I don't.